Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar this morning. This is Evolving CIOs, the Customer Experience Priority, and I am joined today by Stephen Andriol, who is the Thomas G. Lebrecht Professor of Business Technology at the Villanova School of Business. Just want to give you a little bit of housekeeping note before we begin. So first of all, today's webinar is sponsored by Compunnel Digital, so we appreciate their support of our event. The event will be recorded. The recordings will be available to all attendees approximately 3 to 4 business days after the end of the live event. And we do welcome any questions you have for our speaker today. So to submit those, you can enter them at any time during the broadcast in the questions module on your GoToWebinar control panel. We'll answer as many questions as we can get to, so please submit those. And if you're having any audio or other difficulties with the connection, you can also follow instructions in the questions module and submit any inquiries there as well. So our speaker today is Stephen Andriol, as I mentioned at the top. He is a professor of business technology at the Villanova School of Business, and I know he has a lot of exciting wisdom to impart on you all today about the evolving role of the CIO. So Steve, I'll hand it to you and we can get started.
Thank you, Allison, and thanks everyone for participating in this. I think this will be fun, if not maybe a little controversial. We'll see going forward. And as Allison suggested, love your questions along the way. There's going to be 3 questions where we'll poll the participating audience to see what they think about certain questions going forward. So yeah, let me just jump right into this. And this is I've sort of, you'll see this in the bio slide in a moment. I've done all this, so I'm sort of at the point where I can step back a little bit, and I suspect others on the call as well can step back a bit and say, what has been happening with CIOs over the years? And I will go into that, but more importantly, I'll go into where they need to go, and then where they need to go in the specific context of customer experience. Because I think that's really important going forward, especially given what we're going through now, where we're all living online to a great, if not complete extent. So this is sort of part 1 of the discussion. You can see that there, that we're going to look at alignment and shadow IT, all these things you're very familiar with if you're in the trenches of being a CIO. If you're not, then you can take a quick look at that and get a sense as to the general areas. And these are the areas where CIOs need to pay particular attention to and evolve toward, or in some cases, evolve away from. So that's part 1. Part 2, as I mentioned, will be sort of what do they do about this customer experience, and how should that be prioritized, and what kinds of decisions do CIOs need to make as they aggressively and proactively participate in customer experience initiatives in their company. So I'll be talking about that as well. So here's the agenda going forward. There's a brief introduction, and then I sort of feel like I have to talk about 20th century CIOs a little bit. I don't want to date anyone on the call, or even myself, but things were really different, and I'll talk about those in a moment. And then this whole transition, what's happening with CIOs, and how 21st century really is making new demands and also creating new opportunities for CIOs. And then again, the CIOs and the customer experience, and then some conclusions. Again, there's some questions along the way, and then we'll also obviously take questions at the end. My background, again, I've done this. I've sort of lived through this. I've survived the horrible CFOs and the interested but not necessarily all that informed CEOs. Been doing all this for a long time. I'm an academic now, but I do a fair amount of consulting, so I'm pretty close to what's happening out there. I've been fortunate to have some of these published in SMR, Sloan Management Review, which is a great outlet, to put it mildly, and I'm honored to be in that publication for obvious reasons. So let's talk about the 20th century CIOs. Again, I don't want to anger anyone, but this is sort of the way it looked like back then, right? Very much operational and tactical, much more than strategic. I mean, there have been all kinds of pejorative things said over the years that, 20th century CIOs were essentially plumbers. They weren't even close to what's happening with the business strategy. They were maintaining the technology infrastructure. It was databases, it was networks. And after that, I don't want to hear much from you. Occasionally there might be a foot in the C-suite, but let's be honest, because I placed that foot in the C-suite back in the day, and the only interest they had was, you're spending how much money for an ERP system? You're spending how much money for a data center? And that's when the CFO sort of kicked it upstairs to say, you need to kill this guy because he's spending way too much money. But otherwise, it was doing the things I just mentioned. Infrastructure, of course, and centralized with a lot of shadow IT. All of us can remember where you've got these centralized environments, but there's all kinds of spending going on in the lines of business in IT in lots of different ways, not necessarily infrastructure, but certainly in the application suite. And then a lot of on-premise stuff, that's kind of interesting as well. There were actually people back in the day that thought cloud would never take off. Offline, I can share with you some of these stories, which are amazing from major CIOs and major strategists that, this won't happen. But so therefore, they're all sitting somewhere in a data center that was maintained. When I was at Cigna, we had, 10 or 15 of these monster data centers. And then lots of legacy, right? And that has to do more with spending, technical debt, and things like that, and pretty much locked down in many respects. So those were the good old days, but were they really? To some, yes. And I'll say this from the outset. There's been a sense of, do CIOs really want all this strategic responsibility? Or were they better off living in the infrastructure world, the tactical world, the operational world? That's an open question, and we'll be talking about that throughout. My view here is that CIOs should aggressively seize that strategic opportunity. And some of you may agree, some of you may disagree. So do they have competitors or partners now? Yeah, there's all these new titles, all these new people popping up, CDOs in particular, chief digital officers and chief experience officers, and of course, fintech and all sorts of things. And then another open question, which we'll get to, is, to what extent are these partnerships really good? So if you're going to do digital marketing, why wouldn't you be with the CMO? And why wouldn't you be living very closely with the CMO and all the rest of it? And we'll talk about just that throughout this discussion. So let's look at 21st century CIOs who are in transition. And this is the essence of the pitch. This is the argument that I'm making. And we'll go through this, and then we'll go through the customer experience. So operational and strategic, right? Technologically and business fluent storytellers. Now, right from the get-go, you're probably thinking, what is he telling us to do? That is the CIOs. Is he telling us to become salespersons? Is he telling us to be really great storytellers about, the impact of technology, not just the Excel spreadsheet with the ROI? What's he telling us? And yeah, that's exactly what I'm telling you. That's exactly what I'm telling you. Now, there's a context slide in a moment that pops up. I'll jump to it. Is that, what's changed? What's changed is that everything is now digital. And it's, a lot of us who have been in this business for a long time have been waiting years to be able to say this, but there's not a company in the world that can survive without digital investments. I mean, this whole, sort of come late to the party emphasis on digital transformation, my view was, what took you so long? And I know that that's now the umbrella under which you can get funded, so wonderful. But what does it really mean? It means digitizing your business models and processes. And again, what took you so long? So that's the big change. Now, all of a sudden, as that occurs, then the question is, well, what roles do CIOs play? I mean, do they want to become strategic, or they want to stay more operational? We just talked about that. Do they want to cede some of that strategic influence to a chief digital officer or a chief innovation officer, or do they want to keep it? And do they want to become more strategic? And I strongly feel they should become much more strategic, because it's relatively easy, if you will, to extend from technical. So an example would be architecture. We could talk more about that later. But who better to talk about enterprise architecture, which has direct implication on applications delivery across different domains, than a CIO who's also worried about application architecture. So that's part of it. And of course, all the new business models that we'll talk about. There's still some constraints. This is not perfect. There's still always governance fights. Who owns this stuff? Why is it still in the office of the CIO? Why isn't it somewhere else? And this is sort of the expansion or the revenge of the shadow IT spenders, if you will. Like, hey, we've been doing this pretty well for a long time, so we should take it over. There's still a lot of legacy applications. I thought in the context of the COVID-19 crisis that a lot of these are becoming relevant now, and they shouldn't be, in terms of being able to, for example, handle the deluge of requests for unemployment. There are several studies that were done, just broad studies recently, that these systems, these legacy systems, They just can't handle this kind of volume. I was amazed as there's a couple of websites about COBOL. Like, can you imagine in this 2020 that people are looking for COBOL programmers to service these legacy apps in the context of delivery to citizens? Process maps, that's another thing that, the work that I do, for example, go into a company and say, yeah, you should do RPA. And many of the companies say yes. And some of the companies, let's be honest, will say, what's that? And then you're talking about, well, what is your process? What are the processes we'd like to automate or quasi-automate? And they go, we don't have process maps. That's still a constraint. Vendors always willing to help. We know about that. Some of you may be on the call. We love you, but internal and external strategic consultants always, right, that have vested interests. So you need to understand where you're going with the digital transformation effort and the role, again, the CIO should play. There's a real issue, and I'll talk about this, around skills and tenured teams, so to speak. We assign the word tenure to academia all the time, but let's be honest, there's an awful lot of people that have worked inside their companies for many years, if not decades, who may or may not have the right skill set. Right? So you're talking about not just coding, right? So we're not just talking about, for example, in the context of RPA, say Python. We're really talking about your ability to build an app quickly by going to GitHub, and do you know how to do all that sort of thing? So not all the skills have all the requisite skill sets and competencies. And then money, of course, is always the money issue, right? And we'll talk about that as well. So let's just get into it in terms of the 7 steps, and then we'll get into, as I promised, the more customer experience focused CIO. 23% of CIOs rate their organization as effective at business strategy and planning. Oh my God, this is a problem. There ought to be alignment. The CIO should be working, if there is, with an Office of Strategy, directly with the Office of Strategy. They should be working with, if there is a Chief Innovation Officer, directly with the Chief Innovation Officer. The same thing's true of, as I mentioned previously, CMO working in the context of digital marketing. But, and here's the but, CIOs should not be in this business of predicting what the company is going to look like in 5 to 10 years, right? That's a fool's errand, because no one knows, and that's left to somebody else. But CIOs should be focusing on 3 to 5 years out, right, as these business models change. In fact, they should be participating in how these business models and processes change, with process maps, with suggestions for RPA, with competitor analysis, and the list goes on. Shadow IT is not all that bad. I know that's kind of controversial, but I don't think they're rogues. And if they can be good partners, God bless them. And remember, the CIO of the 21st century still owns infrastructure, at least in my dream world. But they also, of course, tilting towards strategy. And the governance should be, hey, if I can find a good partner out there in a line of business or in a domain function like marketing or finance, then wonderful, join the team. Let's do it together. The more, the merrier. Obviously, there has to be some governance about who spends what, but that can be negotiated. The idea that, well, this is mine, I don't want to even talk about it, is insane, especially when someone comes in with a really good idea. So that's something else we'll talk about. Expense to revenue. Is it possible for CIOs to come up with applications that might have broader appeal that could actually be licensed? Or IP? That's a far-fetched one relative to the other ones I'm talking about today, but nevertheless, it is one that maybe should be considered. There have been CIOs who have done this and done this successfully. So it's not just save me money, but can you make me money? That would be a god or goddess CIO, right? Save money and make money. So that's something to keep in mind in terms of you're sitting in a unique position if you're a CIO or a CTO to maybe create something that has license potential. This is a really important one, right? So I think the strategic role of the CIO going forward is to be tracking existing enhancements as well as especially emerging technologies. And building these radars, and all the consultants, the Forresters and the Gartners have been telling us this for a long time. But we really need to do this, and this needs to be a resource inside the company, that if you want to know what's hot, then go to the office of the CIO, because they maintain a list of these technologies, and you can learn a whole lot from about these technologies from the office of the CIO. I think that's a really important role going forward. And then it's, okay, who's the lab here? And again, partnerships with some of the lines of business and the functions that are horizontal to the businesses. But let's do these pilots. Let's do them fast and let's do them cheap. And that's an expertise that needs to be developed. And there's tools you can use. I mentioned GitHub. There's lots of them out there. You can use the tools that are embedded in the cloud providers, because just about everything is now as a service, right? So there's AI as a service, there's VR, virtual reality, augmented reality as a service. It's all happening out there. But this needs to become a center of excellence, because it doesn't do anybody any good if there's this great strategic idea 3 to 5 years out, not 20, about, hey, maybe this technology could tremendously improve or replace the process at hand. But we have to discover this. We have to know whether or not that's true. Let's do a pilot. Let's do it fast. Let's do it cheap. If it's cheap, nobody cares who's paying for it. If it's fast, everyone wants to know quickly whether it's going to work. And this also speaks directly to agility, which we all know about. But we think of agility in terms of software development, DevOps, and SAFe, and all good stuff. But there's such a thing called strategic agility as well. And that's all part of this innovation through fast and cheap pilots. Now, this one is controversial, even though it may not seem so, because this really speaks to who owns innovation. And all the lines of business believe they own innovation. There may be a set of innovation professionals inside of a company. All that is true. But to exclude the office of the CIO, I think, is crazy. And when I say CIO, I mean CTO as well. But I'm not suggesting in any way that the CIO, CTO should own it exclusively, but I think it should lead. And I think it should lead because it's all about technology at the end of the day. So this is one that is really, really important, especially also, and finally, before we move to the next one, and also the one that's most volatile, because the new technologies are coming so fast. 5 years ago, we were not talking about AI the way we're talking about now. We weren't talking about machine learning the way we're talking about now. Just imagine how we'll be talking about these technologies in 3 years. So I think the office of the CIO should lead that, not exclusively own it. This is another controversial one, I guess, because it talks to the kind of personality, the kinds of skill sets, and we love to, when I say we, this is sort of in reference to all the fellow CIOs and CTOs out there. We love to build strong empirical business cases for technology investment decisions, especially because we have to defend them so aggressively with CIOs, with CFOs, and then sometimes even with CEOs, or if the number's big enough, to boards of directors. But this is really about storytelling today. I mean, this is, whether or not you like where we've gone with media, whether or not you like with how the tendencies we're adopting toward management, but this really is about storytelling. And often it's motivated by, hey, the competition's doing this, but it's really about, what do you want to be when you grow up? Again, 3 to 5 years out. And you need to describe the impact the investment will have on business value, especially on the generation of revenue. And notice profitable revenue. It's not just the top line, it's the bottom line. And the most effective CIOs are fabulous salespeople. And again, that makes some CIOs a little nervous, but I think it's really, really important. Truth teaming, this is a tough one, right? So I've had the same problem. You've had the same problem, being really brutally objective, assessing teams. Do we have the right teams? A center of excellence on innovation. Do you have the right people? AI, if that's one of the technologies that's been highly prioritized, do you have the right people? And the people can be outside and inside, right? So it's not just all the internal people, but you may have a partnership. You should have a partnership, a three-way really, with other internal people, right? That's the new positive view of shadow IT, with your internal team, and with a select number of vendors. I mean, that's the Venn diagram, and that's right in the middle is the skill set. But you've got to be objective about each one of those groups. I mean, really objective, and that's very tough. That's very tough. I did a paper on on this a few years ago. I'm happy to send it to anyone that's interested. And it's basically emotion versus evidence, and it's a tough one. It's really a tough one, but it's necessary, again, given the pace of change, and we all know that's the case. And how many of the team, and I've seen this myself in the companies I work with now, how many really know a lot about machine learning? I mean, a lot. And I'm not seeing a ton of that, right? And machine learning, most of us think about machine learning as primarily supervised learning. What about unsupervised learning? What about structured and unstructured data? I mean, it goes on, and not all the teams have those skills. This is about CIOs generally manage projects, and we do this by tracking milestones, costs, and risks. I get that. 30, 60, 90-day views, they're very important. But it's sort of like, the office of project management needs to become program management, needs to become portfolio management. Because all the people to which CIOs and CTOs report, they're all about business value. They're all about positioning in the marketplace. They're all about, how is this going to improve my brand? And most importantly, my profitable revenue. And so everything needs to be related to that. And that goes back to number 6, right? About storytelling, that you've really, and number 5, 6 is about assessing people, but really being able to, package this. Like, here's the story about profitable revenue. And we've got just the right people to do this. So I think it's about programs. Many CIOs and CTOs I've worked with over the years and still today are obsessed with particular projects and project management. It's really not about that. It's about portfolios. Okay, so now let's transition a little bit to how all this applies, and I'm sure some of you have lots of questions or maybe complaints about what I've said thus far, but this really has to do now with CIOs and the customer experience. Now, before I get into this, I want to say a few things about the way things are changing today. So none of us would have thought we would have seen this much movement to online going forward. So the CIO's mission around customer experience is truly changing. So where we buy things now, right? We buy things from e-tailers. So it's whether it's Amazon or we get our food with Instacart, whatever it happens to be, the customer experience now around that process, that online ordering, delivery, follow-up questions, that's going to become the new normal, to use that horrible phrase, but it's going to become the new normal. So customer experience and the role the CIO plays in that, the point is, it's going to expand dramatically, and it's also going to change dramatically. If the trend continues that we live online, and who knows if it will or won't, and I think that, all of us have to decide whether or not this current event, and I mean all of us, not just personally, but in terms of professionals, we have to decide whether this is a snowstorm or whether this is a sea change. If what we're going through now with COVID-19 is a snowstorm, we'll get out of it, things will return to normal, then the customer experience investment portfolio will look a little different than if it's a sea change. If it's a sea change, then everything I just talked about will become incredibly important. So now we're more transactions online, supply chain management online. We're not sending people out to look over someone else's shoulder. All the above, so will change. So that's sort of the preface to this. And I think all of us understand that, and again, depending on your personal perspective, is it a snowstorm or a sea change? That's a new filter through which we pass technology investments in customer experience as managed by the now operational and strategic CIO. So customer experience, understanding levers of influence, multi-strategy, business fluency. We've talked about a lot of these. C-suite occupation. Why is that? Because now the importance of digital transformation. Federation, yes. Revenue generation, possibly. Storytelling, always. Candor, yes. And full cloud commitment. I haven't talked much about that, but I think all of us realize that everything is moving toward the cloud. I mean, if you choose to believe what the pundits are saying, McKinsey and Gartner and Forrester, they're all saying that, in 5 to 10 years, we'll be 70 to 80, maybe 90% in the cloud. Well, that's a big deal, right? Especially if we're looking for example, looking at the emerging technologies and fast and cheap piloting and prototyping. Well, as a service models may dominate even that process, but they also dominate customer service. So we have those issues as well. So how do these levers impact customer experience? So master the internal world. So one of the things that's important about everything that CIOs do is they've got two very big constituencies, otherwise known as stakeholders, right? So the internal world, that's huge for everything I said previously about the general trends with CIOs and now more specifically with customer experience. They've got to master the internal world through the lenses that I described before. Let's review very quickly that not all shadow IT is bad. Strategy needs to be constrained 3 to 5 years. All the things I mentioned as well. So, that's the internal world, the partnerships, all of that, doing process maps. But then we add another stakeholder, which is now the external, which is the customers. So, we've got to deploy the applications to create products and services, experiences that are exquisite and repeatable. Right? So getting a text message or getting an email message from Amazon, how was the experience? Rated, as a star 1 to 5. I mean, really? I mean, it's far more than that. And when there's a problem, we have to create the feeling among the customers that someone actually cares, someone is actually doing something about this. Smart chatbots, yes, but it's going to require more than that. We'll talk about that in a moment. So just remember that customer experience, and applies to lots of other application areas, has two stakeholders from the CIOs or the CTO's perspective, internal and external. Clearly, the external is obvious, but the external builds on the internal. So alignment to some, not all strategies. So customer experience, especially as we're moving to more digital experiences, this needs to become a highly prioritized operational and strategic focus, right? So under this larger strategic objective of digital transformations. So there's no way you can't prioritize this, again, especially as more transactions go online. I mean, this is now a heightened priority. It was big before, now it's even bigger. Now, again, if you believe what we're going through now is just a passing event and we'll be back to normal soon, fine. Then maybe it's not the number one, AAA plus priority. Maybe it's a little bit lower. It's always high, but maybe not that high. On the other hand, if you see this as a sea change, it just skyrocketed perhaps to the top of the list. So that's one thing that needs to be done very aggressively, very proactively, and very unambiguously in terms of selling a budget and selling an agenda. So again, shadow IT is not all bad. That's one of the operating premises of the CIOs of the 21st century. They should encourage it, especially when it involves the CMO, as I mentioned a couple of times before. And if the organization has a CEM, a Chief Experience Management Officer, then clearly that's the triumvirate. I mean, that is the partnership. Now, again, these are different, very expanded roles for CIOs, right? It's clearly a long way from the infrastructure and the plumbing tasks of the 20th century, and even further than the 21st century, more strategic role, because now we're identifying specific endeavors. In this case, it's customer experience. And we're saying, okay, if we need to do this, here are the partners we need. Here's the spending we need. These are the new technologies we need to make this happen. I'll talk more about that in a moment. Number 3, expense to revenue. Again, I mean, is it possible that applications or certain kinds of other technologies can be licensed? I mean, is that even possible? The more we talk about these things, the more people think, well, that's crazy. CIOs shouldn't be involved in creating products for sale. And in fact, why would you create a really good product for sale, and then license it if you'd be giving up a competitive advantage? Why would you do that? Well, there's a lot of ways it can be done. And, it's something, especially if you discover something about, databases, structured, unstructured, APIs, whatever it might be, something that, in fact, maybe it's a bit of an infrastructure horizontal infrastructure to some of these applications. Who knows? It's just something that I think we should be considering going forward. And I know it's not something that CIOs or CTOs often think about, but there are examples. If you're interested, I can send you some offline. Just email me. Number 4, this is so important, right? So CIOs and their partners, you've got to identify and pilot the emerging tech that enhances this. Now, what are we talking about? Look at the list. So obviously AI, machine learning, and we talk about AI, it's machine learning, right? And that's really, really, really important. Social media analytics, what are they saying about us out there? I mean, I know companies are mining this all the time and they're building dashboards about this, but this can be predictive, and it's quite possible to pilot a customer experience application of one kind or another, and then measure its impact almost immediately by monitoring social media. And companies are doing this like crazy, and we're going to see a whole lot more of that. There are platforms available to do this. The biomedical community has been, scraping from sites like Patients Like Me forever, and it just goes on and on. So that's something that becomes part of the whole customer experience innovation through fast, cheap pilot process. Because remember, these are customers, and customers talk, and you need to know exactly what they're saying. So that's the role of social media analytics. NLP, natural language processing, of course. We've all played with these chat bots around customer service. They're horrible. They need to get much better. They need to get much faster and much smarter. They can be anticipatory. We can build these. The CIOs and their teams, if they have the right teams, can build these applications, can build this kind of customer experience clearly. And then AR and VR, augmented and virtual reality, sure, it's going to play a role going forward. Without question, I've already mentioned smart chatbots, very smart, that are not just smart, but they're easy to talk to, natural language processing, smart being machine learning. So we can build these. They've got to get much more personalized, and they've also got to get much more customized to a particular transaction. So they know a lot about you, they know a lot about what you care about, and they can talk to you in the context of all that. They obviously know your sales history and all of the above. Right? Image recognition, of course, that's another technology that can aid customer experience. And then things like OCR and all the rest of it. But mostly, if you were to put a gun to my head, I would say clearly natural language processing, machine learning, social media analytics, all of which contributes to building smarter and smarter chatbots. So that's where the office of the CIO can really play. Because remember, one of the previous assignments, if you will, that I gave the CIOs of the 21st century was you got to track this technology, and you have to identify the technology with the most impact potential, and you got to run these pilots. Well, in the case of CX, customer experience, look at the list. I mean, natural language processing, of course. Social media, of course. Chatbots, of course. So CIOs and their partners and their internal partners, they should be piloting quickly, cheaply these technologies going forward. Again, internally, again with cloud as a service capabilities, whatever it takes, right? With their vendors, whatever it takes. But I think this is hugely important going forward. Number 5, the storytelling again, the impact CX investments will have on business value. This is going to require, lots of use cases. This is going to require follow-up with the audiences, that is the customers, how they feel about something. Is it good or bad? You go back to some of these. We piloted this and social media said this, and we followed on with this, and now we can tell a story because people are telling stories about us. I mean, there's nothing better than a group of people saying wonderful things about their customer experience for a brand. I mean, that's going to become far more monetizable, again, if we're in a sea change, not a snowstorm, than it's ever been. As more and more transactions go online, it's more and more important that we've got good customer experiences that people will be talking about in social media that then become elements that we can infuse into our brands. So I think this is going to become a huge thing going forward. Again, do we have the right teams? Right? So Every organization is looking at, because again, we've got that previous list of technologies that, and there's a longer list in general, but the list that even applies to customer experience. Are the teams the right teams? Do you have the right skills? Do they know the tool sets? Do they know how to measure it? All of the above. I mean, these are difficult in many respects. And I keep emphasizing this. These are tough decisions that leaders have to make about their teams. But again, given the importance of customer experience and given the role of the 21st century CIO, given the velocity of change across emerging technologies, given the aggressiveness and the agility of competition, I could go on. I'm sure you don't want me to, but I could go on. All of these things scream, you better have the right team. And again, that can be a combination of internal, it can be external, but you better have the right team. And then this whole idea, as I said before, the shift from CX projects to portfolios is again huge because, again, if it's a sea change, now this becomes an enormous part of your business. And even if it's not, even if it's a snowstorm, which, by the way, I believe is unlikely. I think this is going to be a sea change. But even if that's the case that it is a snowstorm, it still remains incredibly important because there's a general trend, may not be as aggressive if it's only a snowstorm, toward online experiences. I mean, people, the open question is, now that everyone's gotten used to buying everything online, meeting online, is that going to become the norm, part of the new normal, even if we can return to work? If all that's true and transactions remain online at all level, personal and professional, customer experience is paramount to success and growth in this area. Remember, growth is profitable growth, almost always profitable growth. So this, again, becomes really, really important that you start looking holistically at what is the portfolio. And again, if you're looking holistically, remember the focus on internal and external, two stakeholders. That holistic view will include all of your partners. So obviously the CMO, obviously the Chief Experience Management Officer, all of those. So that's how we're going to be performing going forward in the context of the evolving role of the CIO. So the conclusions, I was supposed to go about 40 minutes. I think I did that. The conclusions are the conclusions here. I mean, I think that, it's an alignment. In part one, we talked about the alignment to some but not all strategies. I'm arguing a 3 to 5 year view is about all we can do going forward. It's going to be tough to go further out. If you go further out, it gets a little flaky, and you start telling stories about that sound like you've been watching too much of Westworld, then that's going to be a problem. So 3 to 5 years is good. Shadow IT, redefined as partnerships. That's simple. Redefined as partnerships, especially when you leave the infrastructure space, especially when you get into applications, especially in applications around customer experience. So this is a different way, perhaps, of looking at spending and partnerships and all that. But I think that's necessary. And I think it's already kind of happening, and it should be. Revenue generation, maybe. That's the one that I would put a question mark after myself. Kind of tough to expect CIOs and CTOs, given all the other things we've added to their agenda, to be able to think about developing technology that can be sold. The fourth one, innovate through fast, cheap pilots. That's everyone's responsibility, everyone. And if it's not, it should not be owned exclusively by the office of the CIO or the CTO, but it should be managed from those offices. The guidance should be from those offices. The tool sets necessary to do fast, cheap pilots should be procured from those offices. Obviously, I'm talking here about leadership, and that's really important across the board. We'll talk about CX in a moment. And then, of course, this ability to storytell, to be the salesperson. I know this is sometimes uncomfortable for CIOs that have been in the technology trenches for so many years, but if you're not one of those yourself, and you find them that can go in and tell these really great stories, because management responds to stories. This tough one, right? Objective assessment, brutal assessment, given all the things we've talked about. More on just overall impact of portfolios and so forth. And then when you go to part two, we talked about, you can see the list there, right? Highly prioritized for CX, aggressively encouraged and you can read those for yourself. And the number 3 is the really important one, because emerging technologies, again, if we move more transactions online, whether we do so aggressively or more slowly, there's no question that these new technologies will impact customer experience in the same way that they're impacting the entire life cycle of the customer, right? So finding something to buy, buying it, servicing it across the board. That's where AR and VR are really going to start to play a role, I think. And then, of course, again, back with the same list: selling and telling compelling stories, and then the same thing about truth teaming and business value. And so, when you think about all this, what I've really done, I'll stay with this for a second, is I've really hugely expanded the role of the CIO. I've really given all kinds of, if you will, new assignments to the CIO. I'm really expectations about the CIO. You're probably thinking after listening to this, oh my God, not only is it all the infrastructure, all the operational stuff, but now they have to be storytellers. Now they have to know all about all the emerging technologies for the external stakeholders. And yeah, that's right. I think it's a more fun job. Not that the infrastructure stuff, broadly defined, wasn't fun too and so necessary. None of this happens without that. But I think that given where we are with digital transformation, given where we are with the role of technology in business going forward, which is only going to grow dramatically over time, we all know this. This separation of business from technology, I think, is silly. It's been silly for about a decade. So now we're talking about business technology, and my argument is this should be out of the office of the CIO or the office out of the CTO, because who's better prepared to be able to deal with that sort of thing than those professionals? So now we'll go to questions. What do you think?
Excellent. Steve, thank you so much. As we go into questions, I think I'd like to ask the audience a question or two. We had loaded a couple polls into our tool, and we had one about the changing nature of the CIO. I think it would be interesting to take a pulse from the audience on how your own organizations are approaching that function. So we'll give you about 60 seconds or so to answer this question. Hopefully you see it up on the screen. How is the role of the CIO changing at your company? I can see the results coming in. Steve, I don't know if you
live with video, so you can yell at me if you'd like.
I don't know if you see them coming in, but the distribution is pretty skewed toward the first option here. CIOs are becoming more strategic and gaining executive power. That's hovering around 75%. And then you pretty equal between 12 and 14. Yeah, more tactical or not changing.
Yeah, there you go. Well, that reflects the trend toward, the digital transformation and business technology being inseparable. So, yeah.
Not surprising, and I would think you're happy with this distribution.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that I'm not surprised, but I think it's great, to put it mildly.
Yeah, we have one more. I wanted to ask folks the final question that we had loaded about CIOs enabling world-class customer service. Just curious what people think inside their own organizations.
Yeah, that's an interesting question too, because there is this movement toward automating much of this, and I was referring to that, in the webinar about we get these crazy polls that did you like it, or these automated chatbots, which many people are very frustrated about, or the second part of the question, it require better applications and some human contact. That's a really interesting one, right? So will there be the need for human contact going forward, regardless of how smart the bots, for example, get?
Right. Yeah, I think not surprising distribution here is the responses are hovering around 90% saying yes, customized applications and human contact will be required.
I'm actually happily surprised by that. I'm a little surprised, but happily so, because when you talk to people, as we all have in our professional lives, about wouldn't it be great? How much money could we save if we automated this process? That's often the pressure that's on so many CIOs going forward. So I'm pleasantly surprised because I think they're right. I think they're absolutely right going forward.
I think we have now asked the audience a couple of questions. I'll get to many of the questions they submitted for you. Picking up on this automation issue, we did have someone curious about the ethics of smart chatbots. So we had a session actually a few weeks ago with a speaker focused exclusively on how chatbots can improve customer service. But as far as privacy and other concerns that might be more of the purview of the CIO and their team, any thoughts there around disclosure or the right kind of setup of those automated technologies to provide that or reinforce that customer experience?
What a great question. It's almost a scary question because, as I mentioned during the webinar, ideally, right, a chatbot knows everything about you because they know your history, they know your loyalty, and that's another interpretation of that, but they know everything there is to know about you, which means that there's a degree of surveillance going on. And that's true of many of these applications. The more effective they are, the smarter they are. It means they have access to more data about you. Now, obviously, the more data you have about a customer, the better you can service them. But again, now we're speaking to these issues around surveillance. And so there is absolutely, there's an ethical issue. I thought the question was more toward the embedded biases and the algorithms. That's another concern. Maybe someone will ask about that. But this whole idea of I can be a really smart CX bot or other CX response processes if I know everything there is to know about you. I know where you're sitting. I know what you buy. I know what you think by inference. And we have a much larger problem in the industry with the relationship between surveillance and efficiency. And I don't know the answer, except that there's going to be a push toward we can make this so much more efficient if we know so much more about you. And just tell us everything there is about you. Tell us where you're sitting, what you think. Tell us your zip code. Tell us everything. And then based on that, we can be so much more help to you. And the early data suggested people will lean toward that. So the concern, with maybe the exception of what's happened in California and a few states with their Privacy Act, the concern among the consumers seems to be, well, okay, we're not that concerned about this. I can tell you that my students are not concerned about it at all, which is frightening to me.
Right. So there may be some demographic factors that play there,
Clearly.
potentially.
Clearly.
I'll start with some of the more micro or specific questions, and then we definitely have some more that get to organizational design and collaboration questions that I think get to be cultural and also a bit more complex in nature. But just one to pick up on your the customer experience, step number 6 about the teaming. Are there specific customer experience skills that the CIO's team should have, and how would you think about building a team that kind of hits all those competencies, or what's shared, what's unique amongst team members?
Yeah, so there's this whole world out there called product management, right? Product and service management. And CIOs and their teams need to actually become participants. I mentioned working closely with, obviously, chief marketing officers, and I also mentioned working with the Office of Strategy. But there's also the product management function, which is hugely important for CIOs trying to understand what the best approach, what the best technology to leverage is for customer experience. And most CIOs don't live that closely with their teams with product management. I think they've got to have those people on the team without question. And then, of course, collecting all the data and participating in directly or indirectly in lots of the focus groups, which are now increasingly done on a crowdsourced basis, but now there's still companies doing them the old-fashioned way. So I guess what I'm saying is the product life cycle needs to be monitored by the CIOs and their teams, the entire product life cycle.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And talking about focus groups kind of jogged my memory, too, to think a little bit about design thinking. And we had a question to that effect as well. I mean, how do you see that type of process or approach methodology plugging into this more evolved role for the CIO and their team?
What a great question. I think that, what you want to do is find as many holistic design systems analysis and systems thinking, not systems analysis, systems thinking members of your team you can find. Because I mentioned the whole life cycle of product management to improve customer experience. That does require design thinking, that kind of ideation, that kind of holistic top-down as well as bottom-up view, which is the essence of systems thinking. Those skill sets are hard to find, though. I mean, you have to grow them or deliberately recruit them into your organization and then grow from there. But that is a very important skill set. And that's very different than the way CIOs and their teams have thought in the past. Great.
Right, right. Other soft skills that come to mind as important?
Well, under the umbrella of storytelling, right? The ability to negotiate, the ability to
and the relationship building, of course, the salesperson nature.
We're going through this at the university now, which is fascinating, right? So we're moving more and more courses, everyone knows, online. But to do a course really effectively online, it cannot be a narrated PowerPoint. So many professors think about online as, okay, I'll just take my PowerPoint presentation and now I'll talk to it. No, it requires a whole different skill set, right? It's sort of like part newscaster, part storyteller, of course, part comedian, you name it. And this is true instructional design. The same thing is true of the office of the CIO, having people there that can communicate at all levels and negotiate, but communicate very effectively in this new world. I mean, I think that's the skill set. Those are the soft skill sets, and they're hard to find too.
Yeah, and some people were asking too about, how much of this is growth and development versus, external hiring. I mean, there's probably no sweet spot or formula for this, but how do you see that changing at all? How this function is growing and evolving, or, are people coming up through the ranks in the similar ways that they used to, or is it more of a bringing in talent from outside that maybe has a different background? Maybe there's not so much IT focus in some of this talent. Is that a trend that you see?
Yeah, I mean, I can be predictive here. I think there's going to be a lot of segmenting of talent. I think the assumption that one individual can do all of these things really well, I think is not a good assumption. I think it's false. I think it's always been false. I think there's going to be people, you just mentioned it, Allison, which was interesting, that maybe there are people that aren't anywhere near as deep in the technology as others, but they're able to communicate it. They're deep enough. They can communicate it effectively to the people that need to be influenced around budget, of course, but also around partnering. So I'm big about segmenting of people across the board. You do this well, but you don't do this well, so therefore you're going to do this and not this. Now, in terms of growth, yeah, I mean, I think that whether you're segmented in this side or that side, I clearly think that you're going to have growth opportunities that perhaps could be led by someone brought in from the outside whose job it is to do exactly that. So I think training and development will be, if you look at the 7 areas, there'll be training and development around each one of them.
Right. That makes sense. We're also had a question about, are there old responsibilities, anything that the CIO could actually shed? Could they be delegated to a different business unit, or could you hire an external vendor? And that might increase, at least their ability to devote more mind share to more of the customer experience development issues that you talked about.
That's another great question, but I think I can't tell you how many CIOs I've worked with and continue to work with that are so happy about the cloud, right? Because the cloud offloads so much of what they were previously responsible for. And so if you're not in the cloud, get in the cloud, because many of those responsibilities that were previously in-house, legacy, all that stuff, they're automatically going to the cloud. And that frees you up to do the more strategic things. Exactly.
Right. That makes sense. So let's jump into metrics a little bit. So you talked about different pilot programs that could be run, and those kind of naturally lend themselves to thinking about what metrics might land behind them. But are there specific metrics that you're thinking about for CXOs? Also as it pertains to compensation, incentivizing a CIO, what should they be measuring as they make this shift toward more of a customer experience focus?
Okay, so there's two questions there, which are good. One, they're both about metrics. So the first one around prototyping, fast and cheap prototyping. There is a methodology for that, which is driven by metrics. So phase one prototype leads to a phase two prototype, leads to a phase three prototype. Has to do with cost and performance and ROI projections based primarily around the phase two prototype, which is a limited launch to customers. So phase one is just, does this thing have any chance of, is it interesting? Does it work? Does the technology actually have the potential to scale? We don't even know. We'll try it. Phase two is limited application, limited deployment. And if those numbers stay green, again, defined around cost, scalability, and impact, and this can be quantified, then you go to phase three and you do a much wider rollout of the application. In terms of metrics for compensation, well, they're all over the place, right? So, I mean, you've got to get buy-in to those 7 areas I was talking about. So there are CEOs, absolutely, that will judge the performance of their CIOs and CTOs based on their contribution to the business in those ways that I mentioned, right? Their ability to do prototyping, have impact, and so forth and so on. But that's almost, and that's back to the skill set, that's almost negotiated. Now, if you're in a public company and you're in the C-suite, then your compensation is pretty good already, right? Because you're going to share in the stock and so forth. You have some equity play. But otherwise, yeah, it's negotiated. But if you choose to tie your compensation, or at least your bonus structure, to how well you do, say, prototyping, that go from phase 2 to phase 3, then it could be terrific.
Thank you. Yeah. I want to spin a question from an audience member. They were kind of curious, I think, coming from a startup background, how they might pivot their business in that CIO role, to keep up with the competition. But I'm wondering too, maybe it's a part 2 of that question. Are there ways to approach some of these transformations you're talking about with kind of a startup mindset? Is that a valuable way to think about, this sort of infiltration of different silos, even silo busting? Working toward more of a common goal. If you think about the alignment with the CMO, with the CEO, that you're focused so exclusively or nearly on customer experience, like, is there any benefit to thinking like a smaller, more nimble organization, or should you be more entrenched in, okay, we're a legacy company, we've got to make these shifts, here's how we do it? I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on kind of the mindset and is the startup culture a model to look to?
Well, without question, it's a relevant perspective to take as it applies to prototyping. I mean, that's where the big shift is. And that's why I mentioned phase 1, 2, 3, tracking these technologies, tracking the competition. You're a startup. In that mindset, that function, right, in the CIO's new agenda, that's a startup mentality. There's no question about that. There's another piece of the startup mentality. It has to do with the people. I mean, I've spent a lot of time, my life, in private equity and, working in venture capital. And, if people are not performing, they get removed, right? So you don't have the time and effort or the money to just, try this out for 2 or 3 years, see if it works in terms of personnel. So in terms of that brutally objective assessment I talked about, there's another startup mentality, if you will, that says, hey, if you don't have the right team, you got to get the right team. Otherwise, we're going to fail. So much of this has to do with speed and agility around the new strategic objectives for the CIO. And in that sense, it's very similar to startup mentality, without question.
I think I would be remiss if I didn't bring up anything about the current pandemic, and a few of our attendees did have some questions there. I left it a full 2 minutes since we've been talking so much about it. It was nice not to for a good 58 minutes. But I guess we have some kind of opposing views. Some folks are wondering, or maybe not opposing views, but just curious on both sides of the spectrum. Are we seeing, given some cutbacks and reduced IT spending and changing of focus, are we seeing the current pandemic kind of slowing things down, or are you seeing IT initiatives, picking up with the shift to much more remote work across nearly any organization we can probably think of in the corporate space? How do you see the pandemic kind of influencing your thinking, your models here, or not at all?
Wish I had an hour for this. No, it all depends on the financial condition of the company. So in some companies that don't have the deep pockets to even consider strategic investments for the next 3 to 5 years. It's going to be about just reducing costs. And the CIOs and the CTOs are going to get that tap on the shoulder that says reduce costs by 10 or 20% by next week, because they're not in the financial position to actually make strategic investments. On the other hand, there are companies that will see this as an opportunity to capture market share with technology, but they have to have the resources to do so. So the first assessment is, where's your company? Are they strong? Are they weak? Are they strategically oriented? But if a company is really in financial trouble, or they have great financial concerns, the job of the CIO is to respond to that tap on the shoulder.
Fair point. I'm sorry we don't have another hour to talk about what's going on in the current state of things, but I do thank you for a really engaging discussion. Lots for us to chew on and digest here. And so the audience is aware, we are going to share these slides out along with an on-demand video of the session in the next 3 to 4 days or so. So I do want to thank everyone for joining us today, being very attentive viewers and asking some great questions. Steve, of course, thank you for sharing your insights and experience with all of us. And thanks again to Compunnel Digital, who sponsored the event. So have a great rest of your day, everyone. Take care. Be well. Thanks again.
Thank you.